Orath had processed 412 worlds. He would process Earth the same way. The file was thick, 700 pages of raw survey data, atmospheric readings, population estimates, linguistic fragmentation maps, infrastructure grids. Standard package. He opened it the way he opened all of them, from the back, where the summary lived, because the summary was the only part that mattered. Species, human, carbon-based, bipedal, single planet, single star, one moon, suspiciously large, probably a collision remnant from something violent a very long time ago. Civilization age, approximately 6,000 years of recorded history. Space capability, early. They had reached their own moon a handful of times. They had sent small machines to neighboring planets. They were loud with radio signals the way a child is loud in a quiet room, not threatening, just unaware that anyone else was listening. 11-point checklist for absorption eligibility. Earth passed 10 of them without question. Point 11 was the problem. Historical continuity assessment. Every species marked for absorption had to show at least one civilization thread running unbroken for 2,000 years minimum. Proof of administrative stability. Proof that there was something coherent to take over. The conclave didn't absorb ruins. It absorbed functioning systems and redirected them. Earth's score on point 11, null. Not failed, not incomplete, null. The field had been attempted 3 separate times by 3 separate surveyors across 2 centuries. All 3 had abandoned the assessment. None of them had explained why clearly enough to be useful. Orath pulled the notes. The first surveyor, 200 years ago, unable to establish civilization continuity baseline. Every identified thread terminates. New threads consistently emerge from the wreckage of previous threads. Pattern does not conform to standard collapse recovery models. Assessment suspended. The second surveyor, 140 years ago, concurring with previous assessment difficulties. The species does not accumulate civilization in measurable form. It accumulates damage and rebuilds without external assistance. Unable to classify by standard methodology. Requesting consultation. No record of that consultation ever happening. The third surveyor, 80 years ago, had written only 4 words before closing the file. These people are old. Orath stared at that for a moment. Then he closed it. Old was not a classification. Old was not a data point. 3 surveyors had gotten sentimental and failed to do their jobs. He was not going to be the 4th. He moved through the checklist with the efficiency of something that had done this exact thing 412 times. The Keth Conclave had been absorbing civilizations for 3,000 years. The process was clean. The process worked. A species received the submission demand pulse, which explained their options. Limited, but explained. And the Conclave moved in. Sometimes there was resistance. Resistance was processed. Earth showed no signs it would even understand a pulse was coming. Orath marked the planet. Objective. Acquisition class low. He cued the submission demand pulse. Standard 48-hour response window. The pulse would reach Earth in 11 days. The response window would open. Nothing would come back. Something small and frightened might try to squawk on the response frequency. Some fragment of a government. Some panicked military signal. That would be noted and processed. He moved on to the next file. He did not think about the 4 words from the third surveyor. He almost didn't. The submission demand pulse left the relay array at 0400 hours, survey time. It traveled at the speed that all important things travel, too fast to take back. On the survey vessel, the night cycle was quiet. Most of the crew were in rest rotation. A junior analyst named Ven was on monitoring duty, watching the passive scan feeds from Sol system, with the focused boredom of someone watching paint dry on a very uninteresting wall. Earth was a background task. His actual work was spectral analysis on a gas giant 3 systems over. Earth was just the thing he glanced at, between real responsibilities. He glanced at it now. The passive scan was picking up the usual noise. Fragmented radio signals, dense and overlapping. Humans talking to each other across their planet in hundreds of different frequencies at once. It was always like that. He had started thinking of it as static. The species was loud, the the way background radiation is loud, constant, unavoidable, not directed at anyone. He almost switched back to his gas giant data. Then something in the radio pattern changed. Not the frequency, not the signal strength, something in the texture of it. For approximately 40 seconds, the overlapping noise of a billion human transmissions seemed to— He checked the instrument 3 times, because he didn't trust what he was seeing. Organize. Not into a message, just into something less random than it had been. Like many separate things going quiet at once. Then it went back to normal. Then stared at his screen for a long time. He filed it as an instrument anomaly and went back to the gas giant. He would think about those 40 seconds for the rest of his life. The survey vessel's communication log showed 1 transmission outbound that day. Submission demand pulse. Sol system. Earth. Standard protocol. It also showed, buried in the passive scan archive, logged as an anomaly and never reviewed by anyone senior, a 40-second fluctuation in Earth's radio noise pattern. It had happened 4 minutes after the pulse was sent. 4 minutes was the signal travel time from the relay array to Earth. The pulse had not yet arrived at Earth. The pulse was still 11 days out, which meant the fluctuation had nothing to do with the pulse, which meant something on Earth had done that on its own. Nobody looked at the log carefully enough to notice the timing. Orath was already 3 files deep into the next system. The file on Earth sat in the acquisition queue, marked low, timestamp logged, waiting its turn with the same patience the humans had apparently been practicing for 6,000 years. 11 days later, the submission demand pulse reached Earth. 12 hours after that, Dr. UN Solis was on hour 11 of a 14-hour shift when something on her deep signal receiver made her sit up straight in her chair. She did not panic. She opened a new annotation file. Signal received, she typed. Origin, non-terrestrial. Structure, artificial. Header, addressed. Coordinates in header, ours. She paused, added 1 more line. That's not nothing. Then she reached for her coffee and started working. 300 light-years away, Orath approved the next acquisition order. He did not think about Earth. Earth was low priority. Earth was already handled. The file was closed. Somewhere in the Conclave's archive system, the 3rd Surveyor's forward note sat in an abandoned assessment. Unread, unreferenced, and completely correct. These people are old. The cursor blinked in the dark of an unused server, like something still waiting to finish a sentence. Dr. Ewan Solis did not wake anyone up for the first 3 hours. This would later be the subject of a formal inquiry, 2 congressional hearings, and 1 very uncomfortable conversation with her department head. Her explanation was always the same. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she handed it to people who would immediately stop trying to understand it and start trying to manage it. The inquiry board found this answer unsatisfying. Ewan found the inquiry board unsatisfying in return. The signal had arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. She had been monitoring the deep receivers with the low-grade attention of someone who had done the same shift 400 times and expected nothing different from the 401st. The deep array at Magdalena picked up a lot of things. Pulsar timing variations, gravitational wave aftershocks. Occasionally a graduate student got excited about something that turned out to be a satellite glitch. This was not a satellite glitch. The signal was tight-banded in a way that natural sources don't produce. Radio noise is messy. It spreads. It bleeds across frequencies. It has soft edges that physics makes when it isn't trying. This had hard edges, sharp ones. The compression structure was mathematical in a way that made her lean closer to the screen, even though the screen didn't get clearer when you leaned closer to it. She pulled her colleague Dae-jung out of the break room. Dae-jung looked at it and said, "Huh." She pulled their 3rd team member Priya off a phone call. Priya looked at it for a long time and said nothing at all, which was more frightening than anything she could have said. By hour 3, they had established 3 things. First, the signal was addressed. The header contained a coordinate set. The coordinates resolved to their location, not Earth generally, not the solar system, but the Magdalena array specifically, as if whatever sent this had been watching the array long enough to know which receiver was listening that night. Second, the signal was a document, structured like a contract, or a legal order, or the kind of official communication that assumes the recipient has no real choice in the matter. Third, there was a response field embedded in the signal's tail end, an open frequency, a 48-hour window starting from signal receipt. Yuen set her coffee down on the console very carefully. "We've been notified," she said. "Of what?" Daejung said. She translated the first clause slowly, working through the mathematical encoding, and the words that came out on the other side were not ambiguous. Terms of absorption. Administrative transfer of planetary governance. Priya sat down on the floor. Daejung said several things in Korean that Yuen didn't ask him to translate. Yuen kept working. By hour 6 she had the full document decoded. 11 clauses. Species rights, minimal but technically present. Labor integration, scheduled across 30 years. Governance transfer, immediate upon response or upon expiration of the window, whichever came first. The tone of the document was the tone of someone who had written this same document 400 times and expected it to be a formality. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement that the humans receiving this were people in any meaningful sense. Just the document. Just the deadline. Daejung was on his phone now, making calls to government contacts, his voice through the glass of the monitoring room fast and rising. Priya had gotten up off the floor and was pacing in a tight circle. Yuen was looking at the response field. Thinking. Not about the 48 hours, not about the government calls, or the people who would arrive in the morning with their serious faces and their urgent need to form committees. She was thinking about the response field itself, what it meant that they had left one. Not a threat, not a silence. A space to speak into. You don't leave a response field in a document like this unless some part of the system somewhere is still curious. She opened the archive. The archive was a project that had run for 11 years across 47 institutions on 6 continents. A compressed record of everything that could be verified and preserved. The geological record going back 500,000 years. The archaeological record. The written record from every civilization that had left one. Every language that had been documented, including the 800 or so that were already gone, and had been carefully reconstructed from fragments by people who spent their careers caring about the shape of dead words. The human dead across recorded history. 4 billion. Conservative estimate. The near-extinction events. 5. 1 asteroid, 2 ice ages, 1 near-nuclear exchange, 1 pandemic cluster so severe the population had dropped to numbers that should have ended the story entirely. The species that had survived all 5 was currently sitting in a monitoring facility in New Mexico, arguing about who to call first. Yuen formatted the archive. Not the cleaned version, not the diplomatic version, which didn't exist because no one had thought they would ever need one. She took the full record, the unedited one, the wars, the famines, the mass graves, the weapons they had built and almost used, and sometimes had used, and the long, grinding process of still being here anyway. She compressed it to a 43-second broadband burst. She attached one header. Simple mathematical structure. You asked who we are. She hit transmit. Then she put the kettle on because she had run out of coffee, and the next several hours were going to require something hot. Daejung came back into the monitoring room. Did you just... Yes, she said. Without? Yes. UN. I know, she said. But they left a response field. You don't leave a response field and then act surprised when someone responds. He looked at the transmit log, at the 43-second timestamp, at her. What did you send them? Us, she said. What does that mean? She poured hot water into her cup, watched it steep. The monitoring room was quiet, except for the hum of the array outside, and the distant sound of Priya on the phone, and the deep, steady frequency of her response channel. Still open, still sending nothing back. "It means I told them the truth," she said. "That's all." 300 light-years away, 43 seconds later, something hit the quantum comm relay network like a stone dropped into still water. Every relay within 300 light-years went dark. One by one, in a perfect expanding sphere centered on a small yellow star, in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, the lights went out. The inquiry board would later ask Ewan if she had understood, at the moment she transmitted, what the signal might do. She said she had not. She said she had understood only one thing, that the document they sent had assumed, in every clause and every term, that humanity had nothing worth saying. She had thought that was worth correcting. The inquiry board wrote this down carefully. Nobody on the board knew what to do with it. The relay blackout did not happen all at once. That was the thing that made it worse. If it had happened all at once, every quantum comm relay in a 300 light-year radius going dark in a single instant, that would have been frightening, but simple. A weapon, an event, something with a clear point of origin and a clear response protocol. What happened instead was a cascade. One relay, then the next, each going dark in sequence as the signal moved outward from a small yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. Relay by relay, like someone walking a very long corridor and turning off every light behind them. Unhurried, methodical, not looking back. The cascade took 11 minutes. For the quantum comm network, 11 minutes was an eternity. A Soviet cargo navigator named Osek was 3 days into a standard run when the route went dark under her. She had been flying trade lanes for 20 years. She had seen relay outages before, equipment failures, scheduled maintenance, localized interference from a pulsar flare. These things happened. You rerouted, you filed a delay report, you kept moving. She watched the blackout spread across her navigation charts and did not reach for the reroute controls. She just watched it. Relay outages from equipment failure spread irregularly, missing some nodes and hitting others, following infrastructure age and maintenance patterns. The pattern she was watching was a perfect sphere, expanding outward at a constant rate from a single point, with the clean geometry of something that had been caused, not broken. She pulled the star chart, found the origin point. Sol. She had never heard of it. She pulled the Conclave Acquisition Manifest. Sol system. Third planet. Species, human. Acquisition order filed 11 days ago. Class, low. She read the summary. Single planet species. Early space capability. No significant military infrastructure. Resistance probability, minimal. She looked at the expanding sphere of dead relays. She turned the ship around. She didn't file a reason with the trade authority. Some things didn't need a reason filed. Some things you just felt in the part of you that was older than your training, in the part that still understood, even after 20 years of routine, that the galaxy was not actually routine. The Dren archivist had no name that translated cleanly into other languages. She was 847 years old, which made her young by Dren standards. The Dren had been spacefaring for 40,000 years and had developed over that time a deep practice of watching quietly and speaking rarely. They maintained a large archive and a small diplomatic corps, which said everything important about their priorities. She received the signal interference pattern, not the source signal itself, but the shape of how it had propagated through the dead relay network, the echo of it bouncing across the passive monitoring arrays the Dren maintained in this sector. She recognized the shape immediately. Not the content, the shape. She had not seen the shape in her own lifetime, she had seen it in the archive. The Dren had a word, very old, older than their written language, from the time before they had writing at all, for a particular kind of civilization. The word described something specific, a species that should have ended multiple times, by the cold mathematics of extinction, and had not. Not because they were powerful, not because they were advanced, or protected by favorable conditions. Because of something else, something that resisted easy naming. The word had been applied, across 40,000 years of Dren records, to 14 civilizations. 8 of those civilizations were now extinct. The other 6 were listed in a separate file, under a different classification. Civilizations we do not approach without being invited. She pulled Earth's file, read the Conclave's acquisition order, read the acquisition class, low, and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Something that wasn't quite alarm, and wasn't quite recognition, but was made from both of them. She filed an immediate advisory to the Dren Council. Do not approach Sol System. Do not involve ourselves in conclave business regarding Earth. Wait. The Council asked what she was concerned about. She told them that the signal had been 43 seconds long, and had shut down 300 light-years of relay infrastructure. Not through any weapon, not through any jamming technology, through its content alone. The Council asked what the content was. I don't know yet, she said. I'm going to read it carefully. I think it should be read carefully. The junior Keth analyst who decoded the human signal never gave a public statement about it. His report was 2 pages. Most of it was administrative, time log, technical parameters, decoding methodology, standard format. The last paragraph was not standard format. I have decoded the header and the initial 4% of signal content. The content is a historical record of the transmitting species. I have reviewed the opening material, which covers a geological and archaeological overview, approximately 500,000 years in scope. I am not qualified to complete this assessment. I am requesting immediate reassignment to a different project. I am also requesting, and I understand this is unusual, that someone more senior complete the decoding. Not because the task is technically difficult, because I think it should be read by someone who has been doing this long enough to know what to do with it. I will be available for follow-up communication in the morning. The report was filed at 2:14 a.m. No one reassigned him. No one read the rest of the signal that night. Orath received the relay blackout report and the analyst's note at the same breakfast meal. He read them in the wrong order. The analyst's note first by accident. Then, the relay report. The relay report. 11 minutes of cascade failure. Origin point Sol system. Timing consistent with approximately 43 seconds after the human response signal had been transmitted. He checked the math. The human signal had not damaged the relays. It had not contained any jamming carrier. The relays had failed because the signal had passed through them, and the relay systems, designed to filter and forward standard communication structures, had encountered something in the signal's data architecture that they were not built to process. The system had crashed the way any system crashes when it encounters something beyond its operational parameters. The human signal had not attacked the relay network. It had simply been too much for it. Orath set the relay report down, read the analyst's note again. Then, he pulled the decoded human signal himself and opened it the way he opened everything. From the back where the summary should have been. There was no summary. There was a header. It resolved cleanly in seconds. He had expected something defiant, a territorial claim, a weapons capacity display, the standard threat language of a species that had decided to resist. He had processed resistant species before. Their signals had a recognizable structure. Anger mostly, fear dressed up as anger. The header said, "You asked who we are." He began the content. It opened with a geological record covering 500,000 years. Carefully structured, not presented as a threat, presented as a record. The way you would hand someone a document and say, "Read this. This is what happened." 2 mass extinction events in the deep record. Population crashes visible in the genetic material. Places in the data where the species had come to within a very narrow margin of ending, and had not ended. Then the recorded history began. He read carefully. He always read carefully. 3,000 years of survey work had made him precise and patient, and he applied both of those things to this. By the time he reached the third extinction level event, this one self-inflicted, a near exchange of weapons that could have ended most complex life on the planet, recorded as occurring approximately 80 years ago, he stopped. He did not close the file. He did not continue it. He sat with it open on his screen for a very long time, in the way that a person sits when something has shifted underneath them, and they need a moment before they trust the ground again. The third extinction. There were 5. He had only made it to the third. Outside the vessel, the galaxy went on with its business. Trade routes rerouted around the dead relays. Emergency communication teams filed reports. Administrative offices issued holding statements about the cause of the outage. In 47 separate systems, ships quietly changed course. Nobody said why. Nobody needed to. The sphere of dark relays sat in the middle of the star charts like a question that nobody had asked out loud yet, but that everyone was already thinking about. Quietly, in the particular silence of something that has just changed without warning. The response frequency from Earth was still open. Orath did not sleep that night. This was unusual. He had maintained the same rest schedule for 3 centuries, through 400 acquisitions, 2 internal conclave wars, and 1 personal loss he had processed with the same efficiency he applied to everything else. His rest schedule was not a preference. It was a system. Systems worked. The human file sat open on his screen. He had stopped at the third extinction. He told himself this was a strategic pause, a senior analyst's right to gather context before continuing. He held this explanation for approximately 2 hours before he stopped pretending, and simply sat with the fact that he did not want to read further. Not because it was disturbing, because it was bewildering in a way he didn't have a word for. He went back to the 3 abandoned assessment notes, all the way back. Not the summaries, the full files, which he had to request from cold storage because they had been inactive long enough to be forgotten. The first surveyor had written 12 pages before stopping. The analysis was detailed and careful. It broke down exactly where the surveyor said it did, at the civilization continuity assessment. Every time a civilization thread was identified and traced, it ended. Collapse, invasion, plague, dissolution. The cause varied, but the result was always the same. Thread terminated. And then, always, a new one. Not from outside, not from a surviving branch of the old one. From the wreckage itself. The surveyor's note. I have reviewed 37 distinct civilization cycles across this species' recorded history. Each one ends. Each one is followed by another that builds from the ruins of the previous. I have no model for this pattern. Standard collapse recovery analysis does not account for it, because standard collapse recovery analysis assumes a recovery agent. External help, geographic shelter, protected population pockets. None of these are present in most of the cycles I've reviewed. The species recovers through a mechanism I cannot identify. The second surveyor had been more frustrated. Her notes had an edge to them. The professional irritation of someone whose tools kept failing to measure the thing in front of them. The problem is not that they collapse. Everything collapses. The problem is what they do after. I've reviewed the post-collapse periods, and I cannot find a consistent behavior pattern. Sometimes they preserve knowledge. Sometimes they lose it entirely and rebuild it from scratch, independently, arriving at the same conclusions through entirely different methods. Sometimes they spend centuries in conditions that should cause permanent population decline. They don't decline permanently. I don't know why. My models don't know why. I am closing this assessment because I don't believe a better methodology exists yet. The third surveyor had written almost nothing. 4 words, a closed file, and no further explanation. These people are old. Orath understood now, in a way he hadn't when he first read it, why 4 words were all that had come out. He went back to the signal content and finished it. The fourth extinction. The fifth. The reconstruction periods between them. The slow work of a species that had lost almost everything again and again. Sitting in the rubble each time and beginning again. Not always smarter, not always better, making different mistakes than the ones that had just destroyed them, but making plenty of new ones. Grinding forward anyway. And underneath all of it, running through everything like a wire that never broke, a pattern he had to look at sideways to see. Not in any single data point, in the accumulation. In the way the same species that had nearly ended itself with its own weapons, had also, in the same historical period, mapped its own genome, developed treatments for its most common fatal diseases, and sent small machines to the outer edge of its solar system, using onboard computers less powerful than the navigation system in Orat's personal transport. Not logical, not strategic, not efficient, just relentless. He followed the classification reversal at 0318 hours. Acquisition order suspended. Reclassification pending. Assessment incomplete. He added a personal notation, the first he had ever added to a planetary file in 3 centuries of survey work. Do not send another pulse. Do not approach without explicit invitation. If they contact us, respond honestly. I have no further strategic recommendation because I have no adequate framework for this species. 3 previous surveyors were also unable to establish an adequate framework. I am beginning to think this is not a failure of methodology. I am beginning to think there is no adequate framework. These people are old. He closed the file, opened it again, read the header one more time. You asked who we are. He sat with that sentence for a long time, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. In 30 years of acquisition work, he had received thousands of response signals. Defiant ones and frightened ones and bargaining ones. Signals full of military data, territorial claims, political offers, desperate pleas. He had read all of them with the same detached professionalism he applied to everything. None of them had said that. None of them had simply said, "You asked, so here." No posturing, no strategy, just the answer. He realized this was the thing he hadn't had a word for. Back on Earth, UN had been awake for 30 hours. The facility had not been quiet since around 6 a.m., when the first cars with government plates appeared in the parking lot. There were people in conference rooms now, people on secure calls, people who kept walking past the monitoring room window and looking in at her with expressions that mixed awe and anxiety and something that, if she was being accurate about it, looked a lot like resentment. She had given 3 briefings. She would give 2 more before the day was done. She answered every question accurately and completely, and did not apologize for transmitting without authorization, because she did not think it required an apology. What she had done, she explained in the same level voice she used for everything, was respond to a communication. The communication had contained a response field. Response fields are for responding to. The 48-hour window had been running. She had made a judgment call under time pressure with the information she had. The inquiry board found this frustrating, in the way that inquiry boards always find competence frustrating when competence fails to ask permission first. The part she left out of the official explanation, she hadn't been thinking about the deadline at all. She had been thinking about the document's tone, the way it had assumed, in every clause and every carefully legal term, that humanity was simply a thing to be processed, a row in a spreadsheet, an entry in a queue. She had thought, with the kind of cold, clear calm that sometimes comes in the middle of the most unreasonable moments, that this assumption was incorrect and worth correcting immediately. She turned back to her monitors. The response frequency they had opened was still live. The channel was silent, but the channel was open, which meant something on the other end had made an active choice not to close it. She made another pot of coffee, sat down. Outside the monitoring room window, she could see 3 people arguing about something she was probably supposed to be part of. She watched them argue for a moment, turned back to her screen. The open channel hummed, carrying nothing in either direction. She opened a new annotation file, typed the date and time at the top, started writing. She did not know that 11 days of silence were about to begin. She did not know that on the other end of the channel, something had just changed its mind about how to handle the species it had almost processed without reading. She knew the channel was open, so she waited. 300 light-years away, in the cold storage of the Conclave archive system, the third surveyor's note sat in a file that had just been reopened for the first time in 80 years. These people are old. Orath had left the file open. For the first time in 3 centuries of survey work, he did not know what to do with something he had read. He thought that was probably the correct response. He sat in the quiet of his vessel, in the long space between stars, and looked at the open response channel from Earth on his secondary screen. The one Ewan was sitting on the other end of right now, annotating, waiting, drinking whatever it was she had put in that cup. The channel was a thread between them, thin as a wire. The Keth diplomatic vessel arrived on a Tuesday morning. Ewan thought that was fitting. The whole thing had started on a Tuesday. It came in slow. They had broadcast their approach from 12 days out, tight beam transmission, careful and formal, the way a very large person moves through a small room with their hands visible. The transmission had opened an 11-day exchange of preliminary communications, tone calibration, translation matrix testing, the slow, patient work of making sure basic ideas could cross the gap between 2 species that had never shared a language, a history, or any understanding of what the other considered common courtesy. By the time the vessel broke into visual range of the monitoring stations, Ewan had received 14 documents, read and annotated all 14, and sent back 7 responses. None of them had been approved by the committee that had been formed specifically to approve her responses. The committee had been formed 3 days after the transmission, when enough governments had been briefed and enough serious people had converged on New Mexico to feel they needed a formal approval structure. She had kept writing anyway. The committee had eventually stopped trying to stop her and started reading over her shoulder instead, which she found considerably more useful. The vessel was small. This was the first thing everyone noticed. The Keth Conclave managed 11 civilizations across a significant portion of the galaxy. By rough intelligence estimates assembled over the past 11 days, it had a fleet that could have done something dramatic with Earth's orbital space. The vessel that arrived instead was, according to the translation exchange, a diplomatic courier, a small one. The landing site was a former livestock auction facility outside Socorro. The committee had chosen it for the flat open ground and the privacy. The parking lot had been cleared and resurfaced. A temporary structure had been erected in 4 days by people who were very motivated to have a structure ready. The vessel touched down clean in the flat heat of a New Mexico morning, and sat there looking alien in the specific way things look alien when there is no familiar context to soften them. Just the bare fact of a shape that nothing on Earth had ever produced, sitting in the dirt as if it belonged there. It sat there for a moment. Then the door opened. Orath was large. Ewan had been told this in the preliminary communications. She had read the physical specifications, and nodded, and felt like she understood them. She did not actually understand them until he came through the door of the meeting room, and she had to quietly recalibrate her sense of scale. His 2 aides were larger. The translation matrix was a joint build. 4 days of back-and-forth work between her team and the Keth technical staff. Not perfect. It had gaps, places where a word landed with the wrong weight or carried an association that didn't transfer cleanly. They had agreed in the preliminary exchange to flag these in real time, rather than push through them, and to work around the gaps together. Ewan had coffee. She offered it because she always offered things when she was in a room with people and wasn't sure what else to offer, and also because it was what she had. She held a cup out toward Orath with the same calm with which she had held out a lot of things over the past 11 days. Briefing documents, preliminary communications, her own professional credibility, before 3 separate oversight committees. Orath looked at the cup. The translation matrix produced the word for it. He accepted it because accepting was correct when something was offered in a context like this. And he was trying very carefully to respond correctly to everything here. He held it. He did not drink it. The temperature alone was a concern. They talked for 4 hours. Most of it was logistics, the framework for a non-absorption agreement, the structure of Earth's status in the wider galactic administrative system, which was, it turned out, a very complicated conversation, because Earth's status didn't fit cleanly into any existing category, and both sides knew it, and neither side said so directly, which meant the entire middle section of the meeting was technically about something else. Yuan worked through her notes methodically. The committee members sitting along the wall behind her occasionally passed updated points on small pieces of paper, which she would read and sometimes use and sometimes set aside with a small nod that meant she had noted it and had decided against it. Orath had notes too. He worked through his methodically. They agreed on 7 of 11 preliminary points. The remaining 4 were tabled for a second meeting. It was, by any professional measure, a productive first contact session. And then, with 40 minutes remaining, Orath asked the question he had promised himself he would not ask. He had formatted it many times during the 11 days of silence, in his private logs, in the margins of his own assessment notes, in the long quiet hours of the transit from the relay boundary to Sol system. Each time, he had concluded it was too personal, too revealing of the specific disquiet that had been living in his chest since he had read the human signal's content and had not been able to find the right file to put it in. He asked it anyway. The signal you transmitted, the historical record. Why did you send that? Yuan looked at him. The translation matrix ran. The room was still. You asked who we are, she said. That is the header, Orath said. I understand the header. I am asking about the choice of content. Of everything you could have sent, a military capacity list, a territorial claim, a counteroffer to the acquisition terms, you sent your history. Unedited. She was quiet for a moment. Where you come from, she said. What is history for? He considered this carefully. Documentation, administrative record, strategic resource. Right, she said. Here it's different. Here it's the thing you hand someone when you want them to understand you. Not your best version, the real one. Because if someone is going to talk to you, really talk to you, they should know what they're actually talking to. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. We've been through some things, she said. You read about them. We're not ashamed of them. They happened, and we're still here. That was what we wanted you to know. 4 billion dead, Orath said. By your own accounting. Give or take. You transmitted that as an introduction. Yes. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that one of his aides shifted slightly beside him. In 300 years of acquisition work, he said, no species has ever sent us their real history. What do they usually send? Their strengths, their capacity to resist, things designed to make us reconsider. And does it work? Sometimes. Temporarily. Yuan nodded slowly. We didn't want to make you reconsider, she said. We just wanted you to know who you were dealing with. Orath set the coffee cup down on the table. He had been holding it for 4 hours. I think, he said carefully, that is the most effective thing you could have done. The meeting ended. The preliminary agreement was signed by both parties, witnessed by 2 humans and 1 Keth aide, in a building that had been selling livestock 12 weeks ago. People shook hands, or the rough equivalent, in the flat New Mexico heat outside. Orath's vessel lifted clean and quiet from the resurfaced parking lot, and climbed until it was a shape too small to see. Yuan stood in the heat and watched it go. Then she went inside and made more coffee, and opened a new annotation file because there was a great deal to write down while it was still fresh. Months passed. The galaxy continued its long process of adjusting to a fact that didn't fit its existing categories. Trade routes that had quietly rerouted around Sol system began, slowly, to reroute back. The Dren advisory, "Do not approach, wait," remained in place. The Dren were patient in a way most civilizations weren't. They had been watching for a long time. They could watch a little longer. And then, one morning, Ewan's monitoring console received a new signal. Not from the Keth. Tighter band. Different mathematical structure. Origin point, a star system she had to look up. A system that had no conclave affiliation and very little presence in any of the databases they had been building over the past months. The Dren. The signal contained one thing. A single word. She spent 3 weeks on it. The word was not a mathematical structure. It was cultural, layered in a way that resisted direct decoding, built up from 40,000 years of meaning, the way sediment builds into stone. Different eras of Dren history had used it differently, and all those uses had accumulated inside the word and were still present in it, the way rings in a cut tree are still present long after the tree is something else entirely. When she finally had a translation she trusted, she sat with it for a long time. Then she opened a new annotation file. "Okay," she said to no one. "Okay. Okay." She never published the translation. She had it tattooed on her wrist instead. Dren script, small and neat, dark ink, right where the pulse sits closest to the surface. Small enough that you had to know to look. The word meant something close to the ones who came back. But that was not quite right. The Dren had simpler words for things that simply came back. Survivors, remnants, remainders. Words for things that had endured. This word was different. This word was for something that had been broken so many times that the breaking had become part of what it was. Something that carried all of its damage openly, without hiding it, the way you carry a scar, not as proof of weakness, but as plain fact. Here is what happened. Here is what it left. Here is what kept going anyway. The Dren had applied this word across 40,000 years and hundreds of recorded civilizations to 14 species. Earth was the 15th. Orath filed his final assessment on Earth 6 months after the first contact meeting. It ran to 3 pages, which was unusually short for a planetary assessment. The first 2 pages covered the preliminary agreement terms, the communication framework, and the administrative adjustments required in the surrounding sector. The third page was the summary. It said, "Earth does not fit any existing classification. I am not recommending a new classification because I do not think one should be created. Some things should not be filed. Some things should simply be known. I have reviewed the signal content in full. I have reviewed the 3 previous surveyors' abandoned assessments. I have sat across a table from one of them and shared a meal, after a fashion. I have one final note, for the record. When Dr. Solis transmitted that signal, 4 billion dead, 5 extinctions survived, the full unedited record of a species that has been ending and not ending for 500,000 years. She was not making a threat. She was making an introduction. I don't know what to do with that. I have thought about it every day since I read it. I don't think I will stop. That is all." He filed it, closed the screen, went to bed. For the first time in a long time, he slept through the night.